Ubuntu has been, pursuing in a lot of processes, and I want to mention how, many of you might be familiar with the Gachacha process in Rwanda, which is a traditional justice system which focuses on reconciliation and community involvement, as compared to individual-focused international criminal tribunal for Rwanda. So when we're dealing with data, it's important that we remember that this is data of people as opposed to dealing with it as an alien aspect of it. So starting with who is this data for, and just making sure that these people are visible as we deal with these data sets. That's one thing that I wanted to mention first. But then the other thing is using gender data to design gendered solutions. So we cannot transform what we do not measure. And yesterday I was part of a session where we were talking about even tools like the AU gender scorecard. I don't know if there's been any recent scorecards that have come out, but it's important that as we design national policies, we also already look at how do we measure, right? How do we measure progress? How do we establish monitoring and evaluation and accountability frameworks that can enable learning from the process of how we are domesticating the EU data policy framework for us to be able to pick up lessons. So that accountability aspect must be built within the processes that we're setting up. Then the other thing that I want to speak about is participation. And participation, and all these are all things that are listed in the EU data policy framework, not just as a checkbox. And come to think of it critically, a lot of us, when we are designing processes of engagement, whether it's a new data policy law that is coming up or new data strategy in a country, we will put out a call for comments and participation from the community. But a lot of the time we are not intentional on how we are doing that, right? We do it in a tokenistic manner. We do it in a, just to check a box. So that intentionality around engaging communities through, participatory approaches to see that local communities are still engaged, especially women and marginalized communities are still engaged in the co-creation of data policies. The last thing that I want to talk about is finding inspiration in the feminist approaches that I've been talking about. Things like, data justice, for example. Understanding that we are not just focusing on fairness, but we are looking at how do these laws bring about justice, because we are still dealing with a lot of systemic injustices that continue to work against a lot of the marginalized communities that we're trying to implement these policies for. So that those are things that I can just mention. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. The Ubuntu, or as they say in Tanzania, Utu. It's our turn as Africans to also participate in shaping global thought on how all these new things like the data economy should be done, and we can also contribute our Ubuntu or Utu thinking. Among other things, yeah. And I wonder whether there's anyone who's working on measurement or evaluation toolkits. Anyone in the room? If you are, I think it would be interesting to hear what challenges or how it is when you start measuring things like the AU data policy framework using data. And we are very lucky that our next participant is actually working in the data. She's going to tell us more about the work that they do in skilling and in helping us to have a more equitable and inclusive digital economy or data economy. So I'm going to ask Lillian to please share experiences on how, on her work, and also how the domestication of this AU data policy framework, whether there are opportunities for more gender transformative or evidence-based and accountable data practices within the continent. Over to you, Lillian.
Thank you. So as introduced, I come from Nigeria. I'm the founder of Niajiri. At Niajiri, we say that we transform access to income-generating opportunities for youth, while at the same time providing a hiring tool for employers. Big words. All we're doing is We create skilling pathways, and this is to self-employment as well as being employed, and we use data behind that. Why I'm here, it's because of Nigeria and the fact that data is at the forefront in terms of who are these people that we are operating with, but then also data out in terms of what pathways are we creating for them. We are also part of the, just as an FYI, part of the AU and the EU Data for Governance Initiative, part of the 10 data social innovations that have been selected across Africa, from 7 African countries. One of the things, in terms of coming to the question, how are we driving gender transformative evidence-based accountable data governance through platforms such as Nigeria? With data, I think there's something that Philip said, that we have to make sure that people are visible, because data is literally people behind. For us, each data point, that means it is somebody who we're helping to help curate and connect to an opportunity. So our work is in analyzing the data points and creating a skilling pathway. That someone or take away, put up a bias if it's accessing an opportunity in one or another. One of the other things that we've been able to do over the last 1 year is ensure that our data models are robust, that they're robust in ensuring that they're inclusive, as well as integrating gender lessons in how we profile our talent, as well as how we train them and match them to different opportunities in the marketplace. One of the things that how we look at ourselves is possibly look at our labor market information systems and being able to provide evidence-based data points to help inform as well as national policies in one or another. So we hope that we are contributing towards the data for good in one or another. I think through having a data policy framework that cuts across all African nations, then that ensures us that we're just not operating in Tanzania, that we're able to scale across any other African nations and still be able to operate without any inhibitions. And I think that is where, we're speaking about the multi-sectoral, because we're going into us as private sectors being able to interact and engage from one African country to another African country without having any inhibition. Those are some of my points, I think, when you're looking at this.
Thank you so much, Lillian. I think you've just opened not a can of worms, but a whole new discussion on, if all of us adopted it, if all the countries adopted it, would it help people to be able to transact across borders more easily, to have a bigger and more inclusive economy for everyone? And it's also really interesting that you are already thinking about that and getting into giving people the skills they will need for that economy. I just want also to measure the room. Does anyone so far have a question? No pressure. I know I'm looking at you guys on this end, but no pressure to you. If anyone has a question, comment on what we've discussed so far, we've heard from different perspectives on how, what opportunities the AU data policy framework provides, but also what challenges there are in implementing the framework. Okay, so if there is no question so far or comments, just to remind you that it's we want this to be an inclusive and participatory discussion. So please let us know if you have any questions or comments. And like I said, we have panelists from different perspectives. We have the DPS from Republic of Gambia on the extreme left. Lillian, who has a startup that does labor skilling. Christelle is from NEPAD, the AU agency that offers technical assistance to member states. And Philip, on my right, is from policy, research, and policy and tech justice organization that works across the continent. I want to go to another round of questions that is a follow-up from some of the things that the panelists have said. And I want to start with you, Philip. You spoke about feminism and infusing feminism into these data policy frameworks. And you mentioned data justice or justice as among the frameworks that we can use to look at data justice. I know for a fact that whenever you use data to uncover systemic issues, it also brings about its own set of issues, because sometimes people don't know, I don't know, sometimes it's a reaction that you don't want to be exposed as being an unjust system. Sometimes also it is that policymakers don't know what to do or how to go about addressing the issues that have been uncovered as unjust. So I am wondering, from your point of view and all the research that you've done, what do you see as potential challenges that CSOs face when supporting feminist approaches or equitable approaches, especially with this AU data policy framework?
Thank you. So as I mentioned earlier on, I think for us, one of the challenges that we've seen in the research, the data is clear, looking at especially how, what data governance approaches exist, because I think when we're talking about policies and frameworks and laws, I think it starts from a point of practices, right? How are governments dealing and handling data? So at that point of practices that exist, because that's what we have right now, with a lot of nations not yet institutionalizing and coming up with frameworks, as we are talking about domestication of the EU data policy framework, which is supposed to provide sort of this framework that has guiding principles on things that nations should look at as they draft national policies. It starts from a place of practices. So when you look at the existing practices around how governments handle data, the very first thing that comes out clearly is the limited representation, right, of certain populations. And of course, that brings in the element of gender data, right? One of the panelists talked about gender disaggregated data, right? So we do have gender disaggregated data, but beyond the gender, the existence of that in the gender disaggregated data and being able to use it is the element of gender data as a concept that just goes beyond disaggregating data, but using data and being able to, have the capacity to look through this data and identify some of the injustices that certain populations of the community still face, right? The recognition that, yes, we've collected data about issues of women, but can we go an extra mile to understand, okay, even women are not homogeneous as it is, right? Grace, your experiences are not the same as someone from Uganda, or, people come in different sets, so that diversity as it is. And we know that Africa is, I don't know if we're even the most diverse continent, but I want to believe we are. We have countries that have, close to 500 tribes, different languages, and these are all things that we need to look at when talking about representation and inclusion in issues of data governance. So one of the main challenges is that limited representation, that intentionality around bringing out the issues of everyone that is supposed to be, legislated for. Then, of course, goes without saying the digital divide and access to technology. So we still have fundamental issues, basic issues, and I know we talk about this over and over and over. But even as we get into, talking about, the principles that are listed in the EU data policy framework, which is, inclusivity and fairness by design, trust, safety and accountability in the data environment, data sovereignty, balance with interoperability, and then the other thing is about promotion of African digital unity and protection of human rights. So, these are great principles, but we still have underlying issues like, the digital divide and access to technology, right? And yes, we continue to see that, access to technology is the basis for a lot of the data conversations that we are having. But then, how do we diversify our data sources, right? As policymakers, as we come up with the data policies, to recognize that there's still a whole section of African populations that are not yet connected, and yet a lot of the data collection that we are doing, a lot of the data that we are collecting and using to inform policies is one that is formed on the basis of access to technology. It will still have issues of accessibility. The insufficient gender disaggregated data, I think that's something that I've talked about, that there's still a notable lack of gender disaggregated data across various sectors in Uganda. When you get to country-specific cases, you still see that there's these fragmented efforts across different sectors. The way the health sector disaggregates data or handles data is different from the way probably financial data is handled. So even countries are still not yet speaking the same language when it comes to the situation of standardizing how we disaggregate it and how we translate that data into actions. Goes without saying, but issues of OGBV and harassment are still, I think for me, that's still a challenge. A lot of data governance discussions and initiatives are digital, are still going to leverage digital platforms, online platforms. But then we know that there's this double, I don't know what to call it, triple threat, that for a certain population, and I don't want even to just focus on women because there's even other populations. And when we're talking about the Afro-feminist approach to data governance, it's not even just women alone, but broadly looking at Africans as a people and the different challenges that different populations have to go through. So, but I'm going to use the case of women. So we have the issue of a lot of, because of the economic disparities, a lot of women can't even access, devices. Later on, talk about the data bundles. But even when they go through all this trouble to get into digital spaces, to be able to participate, in the very many participatory governance processes that are happening, they still now have to grapple with the issue of online violence, right? We continue to see the replication of GBV or offline GBV that we've been dealing with in digital spaces. And for me, I think from a civil society perspective, this is going to be another deterrence that still limits the participation of certain populations when it comes to participating in issues of data governance. The last thing I want to talk about is the dominance of Western-centric frameworks. Okay? Now, it's great that there's the GDPR. There's a place that we need to start at. But it's exactly, what we saw with a lot of the national data protection frameworks that, did the copying and pasting of the GDPR and simply brought a lot of clauses the way they are into their data protection frameworks. Why I think, even the EU data protection framework is more relevant, because it's crafted for the African continent, right? Because we still grapple with that issue of, we look at the, laws coming out of the EU as the very best laws, the very best practice, so they form the basis on what our laws should look like. So it's important that that as EU member states, we recognize that we do have these frameworks. And I mean, the EU data protection framework is here and we're talking about domesticating it, but we still have, the Malabo Convention that we thought would provide a very good framework around, issues of protection of data that still has faced challenges around the uptake and the implementation of it. So for me, those are some of the issues that I still see that might deter, the much progress that we have the potential to make when it comes to the domesticated.
Thank you, Philip. I think especially to your last point about how everybody is trying to adopt GDPR, and I think the panelists can comment on this. Perhaps the AU data policy framework to some extent was trying to, was an attempt at Africans coming up with their own homegrown idea on how data should be governed. And I think we'll hear especially from DPS Hassan on how to translate from the policy process to actual implementation, so that we don't just have these processes where we develop policies but never go past the policy phase to the development phase. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. I just wanted to, maybe in addition to the question that you asked, to highlight some of the key achievements and also challenges that we have faced as a country in terms of developing this policy in the Gambia. Like I said, as far as our achievements as a country is concerned, we already have this Gambia open data strategy, like I mentioned earlier on, and that is the first kind in the Gambia. And we have also initiated this digital addressing initiative, where today we have most of our homes in the Gambia are now covered digitally in terms of geotagging homes, so that at least addresses can be to enable and facilitate businesses to be able to deliver e-commerce and also pinpointing locations for fire and also ambulance services. We also have a G-Cloud and National Infrastructure Policy, collaborative governance policy that also has the platform that showcases different statistical data on economic, social, demographic, population, etc., etc. Now, on the issue of cybersecurity, we have ongoing digital ID and cybersecurity initiatives that also look at government websites, because we have created websites for every government ministry in the Gambia to help so that at least data can be easily collated. We have the National Data Protection and Privacy Law. Now a commission has been set up to look at Access to Information Commission and Personal Data Protection and Privacy Act. But this comes with challenges as well that we have found out within our ecosystem. For example, the issue of fragmentation and siloed data. Presently, we have all different ministries that are capturing different kind of data that are not aligned, that are not harmonized to our national data, for example. So these are challenges that we are facing in the country. We also have legislation gaps as well, because if you look at the Data Protection and Privacy Bill and Cybercrime Bill, they are still pending for enactment. So this is still a gap in our ecosystem. We have also limited capacity and funding to look at the low internet penetration as well, because like I said, as a country, we also have access to internet and also access to so many things that can help the data ecosystem. Because if you look at the low level of penetration in terms of internet, it is a challenge, because most of the people in the rural area are facing this last mile connectivity challenges. So these are things that we need to address. But what I want to say is to look at the issue of informalization in our private sector. I don't know about other countries, but in the Gambia, when you look at our private sector, you look at our MSMEs, that are the micro, small, and medium enterprises, 70% of them are informalized. And in order to get them to get the data that is required to be able to make decisions or policy decisions on them, it is a challenge. So we're looking at how do we try to encourage formalization in that ecosystem. Because if you have 70% that contributes nearly 80% of GDP, and you don't have data about them, it is a serious challenge. So these are things that we need to look at, because I think it's not only peculiar to Gambia alone, but I think most African countries are also suffering the issue of this high informality in the private sector. So how do we get data about them? These are things that we need to look at, because we also look at the less advantaged. For example, women. In the Gambia and Senegal, there's a lot of cross-border trade, e-commerce taking place between those countries. But there's no data to show, because most of them are in the informal sector. They are not registered businesses or don't even know how much they do in terms of generating between Gambia and Senegal as far as cross-border trade is concerned. So these are issues that I think we need to look at, and I think informalization and formalization of our private sector is one of the prerequisites to have a very, very good data governance strategy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm smiling, and thank you. I'm coming to you in a minute. I'm smiling because every time government officials talk about formalization of the informal sector, I know sometimes it comes with some pain, because the more things are formalized, the more taxes are coming. But that's Well, I don't know whether it's on a light note because taxes are not light for anyone. If we can get some assistance to get a mic to the lady on the. There are two questions. Thank you so much. We'll take the two questions. We'll take the two questions and then we'll go on with the discussion. So there's a lady and then there's a gentleman behind.
Good morning. Dr. Sylvia Sateche from South Africa. I think for me, the problem or the challenge that we faced in Africa is that our data is paper-based. It's not digital. And the solutions that we put in place and the frameworks necessarily suggest that we'll be able to govern and manage data when it's digital. And maybe coming to the three definitions, which are very distinct, digitization, digitalization, and digital transformation. And most of our solutions are necessarily suggesting that we will be digitalized or in a digital transformation place. When you digitize, you're taking it from paper into analog. Then you digitalize, you make use of tools. And when you digital transform, you are now changing the whole business model and the ecosystem that is based on data. But the challenge that we are facing is that the other panel members spoke about the cut and paste of where we take regulations from your developed countries and we cut and paste and try and Africanize this. But our real challenge really sits in the fact that our data is very manual. Our data is sitting on paper. You go, you visit government departments, you fill forms. You do everything, you fill forms. And those forms are stacked and just packed somewhere there. And the leakage that can happen, as it's very large. But whereas our frameworks and the solutions that we're putting in place suggest that we are digital or even digitalized to some extent. Thanks.
Thank you for that comment.
Thank you. I am from Ethiopia, Henok Mulgeta. Currently, we are developing a data governance framework for Ethiopia. So we are part of the team. Just to, as a pre-assessment or preliminary work, we have revised various policies, standards, and frameworks. Like the Budapest Convention, Malawi Convention, GDPR, and others, among the many. And we have tried to just summarize the results of our analysis, just to make them, or just to align our data governance framework with regional, continental, and international data-related policy and frameworks. So some of the advantage that we just took from the EU data policy frameworks are economic growth and innovation. It encourages economic growth and innovations, harmonization among different member states are possible with suitable actionable items which are stated in the policy. And it has strategic guidance, and most importantly, it follows human-centric approach, which is the core pillar of Industry 5.0. The core pillar of Industry 5.0 is human-centric solutions. The other, it has robust framework elements such as capacity building, infrastructure development among member states, and other core pillars are stated in the policies. However, there are some limitations that we have observed. The first one is a lot of initiatives are out there, fragmented governance framework among member states, even within a given state, such as Ethiopia, we have fragmented data governance framework. So it might be quite difficult for alignment or harmonization of the frameworks. The other, data quality. One major issue is data quality and availability. And the other, inequality of resource at different member states for the implementation of the EU data policy framework. So these are some limitations that we have observed. So what's your reflection in this regard and other merits and limitations of the EU data policy framework? Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience with Ethiopia's efforts to domesticate the EU data policy framework. I understand there is one more question or comment.
Thank you. I'm Christian Fazili from the DR Congo. My question is to address Philip, considering the data protection at the regional level, at the continental level. As you mentioned, the Malabo Convention. You know, the Malabo Convention took more than around 9 years to get in force. So I would like to know what are the main challenges for the implementation of this convention regarding the African perspective. And one more comment is about the fact that, you know, when they enact at the continental level such legislation, the implementation took time. And now, you know, regarding that convention, it's not updates. There are some new issues, including the artificial intelligence, which must be included in that policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question, which is to Philip. So if you're ready, you can answer that one very quickly, and then we can have Crystal, Lillian, and DPS Guy respond to the two comments. The first one, I'm sorry I didn't get the names. The lady from South Africa was talking about the conceptual issues that we have when we assume so much. We assume that we have the frameworks to do digital governance when we are actually, you know, may not have everything in place. And then we've also had an experience from Ethiopia about their journey with domesticating the EU data policy framework. So starting with Philip.
I think a simple answer to your question, the gentleman from DRC, with the Malabo Convention and what the challenge has been, I think it's plainly it's political will. I think so. Because we know that it's Malabo Convention is still considered adequate in principle. You know, when you look at it, it's very adequate. But it has not been widely ratified or even implemented, which has limited its practical impact, especially on things like data flows, because we are discussing them. But in principle, it's adequate. It addresses quite a lot of things. So to answer your question plainly, I think it's been the political will that we've not seen a lot of entities ratified.
Okay. Thank you for that. Maybe, perhaps, the politics are changing because the digital economy is also bigger. So, food for thought. Over to you, Christelle.
Thank you, Grace. Maybe to add up to what Philip is giving as a response, the African Union is currently working on a continental cyber security strategy. I believe they will take into account the fact that they will consider the gap as of, you know, looking at the involvement within the ecosystem, and then try to address them as recommendation within the coming strategy. Mentioning the Malabo Convention, that's one. Coming back to the observation of the man from Ethiopia, I think some of the challenges that he mentioned are some that we mentioned earlier. I didn't take any notes, but if I recall, or maybe you can recall, Grace, so I can quickly comment.
Sorry about that. Some of the challenges are that there are so many frameworks that they have to look at in order to harmonize them as they come up with their own policy. And then he was talking about also the issue of infrastructure, that there's a lot to be developed over there. And then also the issue of that there are so many solutions, and somebody has to keep reminding people to come up with human-centric solutions.
So some of the things that we have learned as we are implementing, as we are domesticating and implementing the framework nationally, is that it's not... it's a collaborative work, and at several levels. It's not only about developing the regulatory framework, but also working, I think my colleagues have mentioned that, Honorable has mentioned it, it's about making sure that we have the connectivity underlying, which is one of the pillars of the framework, the foundational infrastructure, making sure that the member states have the required foundational infrastructure, but also it's a mix of not only looking at the regulation, looking at the underlying infrastructure, adding it to developing the mechanism to monitor, to regulate the ecosystem. So I think it's a mix. It shouldn't be taken as one. Yeah, that's another comment that I wanted to make. And to the lady of South Africa on the debate between digitalization, and then the digital transformation is true. But I think the ambition of the framework is also to create that enabling, it's just the start of the work, to start even thinking about considering the data as something to use. So I think is one of the reasons why the framework is designed and is also domesticated. I'll move to Lillian. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I think I will start with the second question in terms of localization from the experience about Ethiopia. So as a private stakeholder that is responsible for either processing or controlling, when I look at Tanzania, so I'm going to start from the local context and then linking it to the importance of having a harmonized data policy framework. There is awareness building that needs to happen, and this is to users who are part of contributing to the data points. And then there is a responsibility. Now I'm looking at us as private stakeholders that is responsible for using this data to help inform, to help put up evidence-based notions, etc. I was talking recently to an individual, and we were talking basically about looking at how data in the wrong hands can be monopolized. When you look at nations, youth summit, and this is just going to open up a whole other can of worms, but the fact that when data is in the wrong hands of people, they can do whatever they can do with it. So having a harmonized, I think, coming down to there is the local contextualization that needs to happen, because much as we are as African nations, but there's still different elements that's across the board. But there is a great importance of moving from the local to the national, which is the national data policies that are being designed, but that's to actually align with the AU data policy framework. Reality on the ground definitely is different. Again, speaking from a perspective of when we started Nigeria, thought every information will be available, and yes, there is an increased penetration and access to data, but we still had to pivot and get creative. So the human-centric design, like there's some places that we have to have partnerships with universities so that students can actually have access to a computer lab, because not every student in university has access to a personal lab, a personal computer. So there is need of localization, but a majority of having a framework that we're all adhering to at the end of the day. How that is designed or developed on the ground, I think, can be part of the human-centric design. But having an overall framework that we're all aligned to, definitely will build. And I'm coming back again. I'm the private sector here, because when you look at the end game is to be able to transact, to be able to engage, to be able to be much more harmonized and have a framework that we can move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Like I said, I totally agree that we have so much data in our economies that we cannot even ascertain whether these data are valuable or they're just not there valuable. Because when you talk about data, data is gold, as we said nowadays. But if you look at today in a perspective of Africa, for example, we have a big challenge of identity. Because according to research, over 500 million Africans don't even have an identity to say. So when you look at also our infrastructures, you have so many challenges as far as connecting the people and the cost of internet. In the Gambia, for example, we have one of the highest costs of internet in the sub-region. So now, how do you encourage people, to access the internet and get the information about themselves, because they have a challenge of data, because you have multiple informations about one individual person that you don't even know which one to take at the end of the day. So these are challenges that we are trying to address as a nation. But notwithstanding as well, the harmonization of the data within our ecosystem, which is a big challenge, for example. Because if you look at the Gambia today, so many institutions are keeping their own data, and there's no center where you can store all this data. For example, having the data center, because the highest data center we have in the Gambia is about 2-tier, which we are now trying to upgrade to 3-tier data system, to data center, for example. So data harmonization, localizations are all these challenges that we are trying to address. And we hope that with this new policy that we have, with the support of the EU, we can be able to address some of these gaps and some of these things. But like I said, there's so much data around. Today, over 16 billion mobile phones are owned in Africa. And then how many of those mobile phones have access to the internet due to the cost of accessing or paying for the internet? So these are things that we are looking at. And I said, now to have a highly digitalized economy in Africa, we need to harmonize some of this data that we have, so that at least we can be able to move as one entity instead of working every country doing their own strategies that doesn't align with the regional or the international strategies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those thoughts. As you can see, I think what we can conclude from listening to the different experiences is that the data policy, harmonizing the policy and domesticating the AU data policy framework is a work in progress. And even actually working on the data, developing the standards, making sure data is available for use, and even developing the concepts as the participant from South Africa was talking about, clarifying what concept we are using. Are we digitizing or digitalizing? Is still a work in progress, because we are doing these things as we move and as we enter the digital economy. But that is my conclusion. I don't know what my panelists or the panelists would conclude about this topic that we have been discussing, because we are now coming to the tail end of our discussion, unless somebody has a burning question, which would be happy to take and answer. This This panel, we were discussing aligning national data policies with the AU data policy framework, and we were listening to best practices and lessons from different perspectives. We had a DPS guy who is a policymaker and policy implementer in the Republic of Gambia, Lillian, who's a private actor or private practitioner working with data in a startup called Niajiri in Tanzania, Christelle Onana, who is an analyst with the AU, NEPAD, an intergovernmental body that offers technical assistance to member states of the AU, and Philip, who's the director of programs at Policy, Continental Research and Tech Justice CSO. So I want them to give their parting shots, what they think about this topic, and something that we could go to think about as we leave the session. I've repeated their names so that as we go for tea break, you can approach them and discuss any other thing we may not have covered, because as you've heard, there are still so many issues to unpack with the topic. So DPS has the mic, so we'll start with him and come down the panel.
Okay, thank you very much. Like I said, mine is very short, because like I said, as a country, as we develop our first data policy, we see the AU DPF as a guiding light, to be honest, and what that can only not unite our continent's vision, but also enables each country, no matter how small, like the Gambia, to build a data-driven society that leaves no one behind. Thank you very much.
I think my parting shot as a private actor in the space of data processing and controlling, it is paramount that national policies speak to, because when I look at my company, I'm looking at scaling across Africa. And if I'm a database company, then I should be able to scale across Africa without as many inhibitions as possible. So having a harmonized data policy framework that we can easily do that means that we can actually tap into the African population and transform the lives of youth to access income-generating opportunities. So aligning national data policies to me is paramount and a key thing that we should all be engaged in. Thank you.
Thank you for the final word. For us, it's about, we have started the conversation. I think we still have a long way, some way to go. It's about collaborating on this effort, creating the platforms, whether virtual or physical, to share, to learn from each other, to build institutional knowledge, whether national or continental, to allow the rest, the ones who are still behind, to take from there and upgrade. Thank you.
I think fundamentally what this conversation for me shows me is still on the issue of harmonization. So I think also, the AU to think about how do we incentivize harmonization, because it looks like it's really going to be, the driving factor for everything that we're talking about. But also for me, to development partners, especially those that we have as part of the Africa IGF that are driving the conversation around data governance on the continent, is designing, in the spirit of avoiding fragmentation, is how do we make sure that development partners design programs that include all RECs, because I know that development partners have a role to play here. But also, in terms of RECs, we still continue to speak different languages and have different standards on, whether it's on digital rights, emerging technologies, and data protection. So that we need that kind of shared language around what is it that we are developing strategic infrastructure. And of course, that brings in the conversation of shared infrastructure, because speaking about tier 1, tier 2, or tier this, like data centers, for example, we know that there's still countries or even regions that are struggling when it comes to like the setup of data centers. So what is the the value in setting up shared infrastructure like that? And then lastly, something that I would want to talk about, of course, I can't live without talking about institutionalizing institutionalizing equity and gender inclusion as we're having these conversations. And lastly, understanding that we have to cater for our country's interests, but also we're part of this broader ecosystem, right? So we're designing for the local realities, but also, we're designing for the broader ecosystem. So the task is in, making a balance between those. One thing that I remember, Grace, that you mentioned yesterday, I think even the DSP was part of that panel in the other room, is around, we keep talking about, for example, cross-border data transfers, but for certain countries and AU member states, it hasn't made value yet. It hasn't made sense yet. So, Grace, you are speaking about probably simulating, for example, what is the value of cross-border data transfers, because when you're speaking to, policy makers and all these other states, they're looking at what, for example, economic value do cross-border data transfers bring about? How do they add to the GDP? What value exactly, economic value do they bring? So we need to also think about how do we simulate the value that could come out of cross-border data transfers, because we also know that data is only valuable if it is shared, right? Because that's the value creation. So how do we simulate that value for people to see that, okay, this actually makes sense when we talk about cross-border data transfers, which is already happening. But like DSP has said, it's in the informal sector. A lot of the people that are trading across borders are not documented. It's the women, the young people that are part of the informal sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you also to our audience for actively listening and participating, and to the three people who gave their comments, the lady from South Africa, the gentleman from Ethiopia, and the other gentleman from the DRC. Thank you so much for making the panel more lively. So with that, I officially declare this panel, the formal part closed, but please feel free to interact with the panelists and ask them further questions. Asanteni sana.
Thank you very much.